Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Issues and Answers. I'm Anthony Moreno. On March 31st of this year, in a special legislative session called by New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, state lawmakers approved the legalization of recreational cannabis for adults over 21. It's an effort that has failed for years in New Mexico, but this year, lawmakers delivered on what polls in the state have favored. On this program, we will learn more about the cannabis industry and try to understand how it can make a difference in our state's economy. We'll talk with experts in the industry, we'll discuss the bill, and we'll hear from state lawmakers with different perspectives on the issue. Let's start things off by learning more about the industry. Joining us now is Ben Lewinger, Executive Director for New Mexico's Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, and Wylie Atherton, General Manager of 7 Point Farms. Thank you both for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having
Anthony.
me.
Ben, I'd like to start with you. Sponsors of this legislation said that this could potentially create 11,000 new jobs, $300 million in annual sales, and $50 million in revenue for the state in the first year alone. Now, an analysis on the bill said it was more like $30 million, but I'd like to hear from you. What can New Mexicans expect with this industry and the legalization of recreational cannabis?
Sure, thanks, Anthony. So the numbers that we're hearing are 11,000 new jobs and $30 to $50 million a year in revenue to the state for a fully matured market. So I think the numbers that we can expect the first few years are maybe in the $30 to $40 million range annually. But then after 5 years, in excess of $50 to $100 million for a fully matured market. And that's recurring revenue. That's revenue that we're going to come to expect and rely on every single year.
Now, Ben, can you kind of give us a better understanding of what is involved in this industry? Obviously, New Mexico has had a medical marijuana program where we've seen it grow continuously throughout the years since it's been around, I believe, in 2007. Now, this program and this legalization, what's it going to do for the industry, and what kind of jobs can we expect to see open up in our state?
Sure. So New Mexico is actually the first state to have a medical cannabis program back in the 70s, where we treated 600 cancer patients, and it was a model program across the country. And then the medical program, as we come to know it now, was passed in legislation in 2007. So we have a very robust, vibrant medical cannabis industry that is existing now that's serving well over 100,000 patients. And I think what we can expect with an adult use market is it's going to look a lot similar to the medical cannabis industry, but it's just going to grow. We're expecting 5 to 7 times the production, 5 to 7 times the consumer base. And including the border of Texas, if you go 20 miles into the border of Texas, that almost doubles the consumer base for an adult use market in New Mexico. So I think what we can expect is an industry that grows. And when I refer to the industry, I'm talking about more than the license holders, more than the producers and manufacturers, but marketing companies, architect firms, CPA firms, law firms, all these different businesses that will grow and cater to the cannabis industry as it matures in New Mexico. So that 11,000 job number that we're mentioning, that's more than bud tenders, which are the people that help educate you and serve you your medicine now and serve you your adult use products in the future. But we're talking about scientists. There's a research license. There's a testing license. So we're talking about science. We're talking about, again, architects, marketing professionals, all these different types of businesses and individuals that will come to grow with the cannabis industry in New Mexico.
Now, many folks in New Mexico may have seen dispensaries appear in their communities. Now, an analysis said that this could create over 1,500 jobs at dispensaries alone. Can you kind of give us an understanding of just how many people usually work at a dispensary in New Mexico?
I think that's probably actually a better question for Wylie, who's on the ground, boots on the ground in one of the most successful dispensaries, or one of the most successful grow operations in New Mexico now.
Wylie.
Sure. So, in regards to how many staff one dispensary has, it's just a question of scale. A dispensary in a larger market that sees more foot traffic is going to have more staff, and a dispensary with lower volume throughput is going to have fewer staff. Our Socorro store, we have 3 staff on shift at any given time, and same for our Cedar Crest location, but we're expecting to have close to double that in our Albuquerque location when we get that open. And so it's really, there's not a static answer to that question, but it's going to be, a significant portion of the jobs created is going to be in the retail side of the operation for sure.
Can you kind of give us another understanding about growing in the industry? What kind of jobs are we looking at in that area of the industry? Sure.
There's a really wide array of jobs in production. There's many hands go into the raising and the processing and the bringing to market of the product before it ever reaches the retail operation. So, you'll have your grow staff and management at the farm or at the grow. You'll have a head grower who kind of oversees the whole operation, and then you'll have post-harvest handling. So anybody, once the plants have been harvested and dried and cured and are ready to move on to the next step, there's an intermediate step where it gets processed, handled, trimmed, further cured depending on the operation, and then it'll get either packaged or shipped wholesale to the end user or to the wholesale client. So quite a few jobs in that sector as well.
Wylie, how many dispensaries do you have across New Mexico? Can you kind of give us an understanding of 7 Point Farms?
Sure. So we have 2 right now. We have one in Socorro and one in Cedar Crest, and we're in the early stages of opening one in Albuquerque as well.
Okay. Another big issue that I've noticed that some people have brought up in this industry is change in demand. Ben, can you kind of share with us about what you've seen in this industry with the demand change as different markets have fluctuated, and what we're looking at as far as perhaps what consumers might be interested in?
Sure. I think, we have over 100,000 people enrolled in the medical cannabis program as it is right now. And I think, honestly, that probably serves a greater number than that 100,000 percentage, or 100,000 person number. And I think that the numbers that we've seen, we can expect 5 to 7 times that with an adult use consumer base. So the challenge with this legislation, and it's a very aggressive rule promulgating period. It's a pretty aggressive period of time to, really create the regulatory framework for how this is going to work. And part of that is ensuring that we're able to get plants in the ground and that we're timing the different points in the timeline sufficiently so that we can have sufficient supply on that first day that we open the floodgates and we have adult use sales. And I think in terms of products, the governor was very clear, and legislators working on this legislation were very clear that we really wanted to protect and enhance and continue to grow the medical cannabis program. And in other states that had a medical cannabis program that made the shift to adult use, we did see a decline in the numbers of people who are enrolled in the medical cannabis program. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, and I don't want there to be alarm when we see those numbers from 100,000 dip a little bit with an adult use market. But I also think that patients need different kind of products. Patients like suppositories, patients like inhalers, patients like water soluble cannabis powder. They're different products that I think cater to a patient market, and having that differentiation in products is going to be one of the key things that really helps to sustain and grow our medical cannabis program. And I think in terms of consumers, for a long time, flower has been king. Flower has been what most people purchase, what most people like to use. But I think we're seeing a transition from cannabis flower, which is the buds that people smoke or vape, into more manufactured products. So oil distillates, different kinds of products like rosin or resin, or different products that are made from the trim or from those buds, and created into a product that is potentially more shelf stable, potentially easier to dose for consumers. And I think New Mexico will track along with the rest of the country in more demand for those manufactured products and less demand for flower, which has been the number one product for so long in the industry.
Okay, so Wylie, with what he just mentioned about possible changes, I mean, what are you preparing for with your business, with expecting more people to come in who aren't in the medical marijuana program in New Mexico?
Sure. So 7 Point is kind of uniquely positioned in the sense that we started as a wholesale only operation and slowly scaled up into retail. But I would say that we're definitely one of the outliers in how much of our capacity is dedicated to production in, versus how much is dedicated to retail. So we have a much greater percentage of product available on the back end to put through our retail operations in the event of shortages or of a huge surge in people coming through the door and buying our products. Like I said, we're definitely the outlier. I think everybody else is kind of in that rock and a hard place between scaling up now within the structure of the medical program versus waiting to see what kind of rules get promulgated and what the licensure and the production structure looks like, so that they know what kind of moves they need to make. But I don't think anybody would argue that just across the board, New Mexico needs to increase its capacity to produce to meet this new demand. I think that's generally a consensus from everybody.
So Ben, if there are folks who are in the medical marijuana program right now who are very concerned that they're going to be impacted by this change, what would you have to say to them?
I think there will be positive impacts by this change. I think one of the biggest things in protecting the medical cannabis program is, finalizing that there won't be any GRT on medical cannabis, and there definitely won't be any other taxes. So the cannabis excise tax, as it's written, none of those taxes apply to the medical cannabis industry, because cannabis is used as medicine by those patients, and it shouldn't be taxed. So again, that diversity of product, the lower price point, I think is what's going to keep people in the medical cannabis industry. And then there are provisions in statute that say that companies have to reserve a percentage of their product for medical cannabis patients. And if there's ever a lull, new producers, it's written in statute that new producers could be asked to only produce for a medical market up front. And while you can apply to be a medical only cannabis provider, you can't apply to only provide cannabis in an adult use market. So every single producer, every single dispensary in New Mexico will have to continue to serve the medical cannabis program into the future.
Now this legislation is going to allow for those medical cannabis retailers to be able to, and producers to hold a dual license, is that correct?
That's correct. And, this was one of the lessons learned from Colorado, where at the beginning of their adult use markets, they had separate lines, they had separate registers, they had separate facilities for medical patients and for adult use patients. And I think one of the real forward thinking parts of this bill is there's there's not a segregation of the two markets. If I'm a medical cannabis patient, I'm going to come up to the exact same register. I'm going to be in the exact same store looking at the same or similar products as an adult use patient. And I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned from other states that was incorporated into this legislation.
So will producers and folks already with a medical cannabis license in retail and be able to get into this industry quicker? I'm seeing that some reports where they're going to be able to get into it about 30 days more in advance. Is that correct?
No, the timeline is, and one of the adjustments in the bill was all the dates the language for the dates was changed to no later than. So if RLD were particularly aggressive, we could actually see rules promulgated, license issued, and the first adult use sale earlier than these dates. But the way it works is no later than September 1st, the production licenses are issued. So these include new production licenses, the micro production licenses, which I hope we talk about, because I think the micro business licensure is one of the really good approaches with this bill. And then what they're calling the legacy licenses. So the three different license types for production are going to go into effect no later than September 1st. And again, that's just to make sure we have plants in the ground and make sure that we're creating product to get ready for this influx of new consumers no later than April 1st of next year.
Okay, well, I mean, the Santa Fe New Mexican did a pretty good report on this on a breakdown, and they reported that new cannabis laws working with the current medical marijuana cannabis program, they said in the reporting that current medical cannabis holders can apply for a dual license to produce and sell recreational cannabis, and they will get a 30-day head start on newcomers to the business. So is that incorrect?
My reading of the bill says, yeah, that's incorrect. The date for legacy licenses, legacy production, new production licenses, and micro businesses is no later than September 1st. So, the medical cannabis industry is continuing to go and make sales to cannabis patients now, but the way I read the bill is those three license types start at the same time, no later than September 1st.
Okay. I'd like to hear from both of you. There was some criticism on this bill from both sides of the aisle, actually, that this bill was written for insiders and people in the industry, and there was going to be a lot of money available for people who are already in the industry, especially big companies in cannabis. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think there is some truth to that?
I'm not sure what money is going to be available for the current medical program. I think that this bill strikes the right tone of really laying a strong foundation with the existing medical producers who understand the business, understand the market in New Mexico, and these micro licenses, which, that's kind of our state's version of equity licensing, which we've seen be successful and fail in other states that have tried to include those provisions in their legislation.
So was this written for insiders, though? I mean, is it easier if you're already in the business to really get a head start on this thing?
It's in the sense that you already have facilities and you're already growing cannabis. Sure, it's easier, but I think we're going to see more incentives for micro licenses. And again, the production licenses, whether you're an existing LNPP in the medical program or whether you're a brand new license, they have the same start date of no later than September 1st.
Okay, Wylie, your thoughts on people saying that this law was really pushed through with insiders and lobbyists, and it's going to benefit the big companies. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Sure, I can understand, why people feel that way. I think Ben hit the nail on the head. It's a very fine balance to strike, between giving away this massive market share right out of the gate to well-capitalized producers and experiencing shortages right out of the gate because we didn't, capitalize on the production capacity that already exists here. So it takes about 100 days from beginning to end to get a plant to the end consumer's hand. So we need to think 100 days backwards from any time we're going to experience a surge or a potential moment of shortage. And so, we were, 7 Point and myself were very involved in the legislative process as well. And it was definitely harrowing at times watching the needle bounce back and forth. But I think that we struck the right balance where we're going to make the best use of the production capacity that's already here, the facilities that are already operational, and the operators who already know how to bring that product to market, so that when the opening gates are swung open and all of a sudden we have a huge surge in legal users, that we don't experience a shortage that just makes more problems than it solves. And so the trouble that I think a lot of people, myself included, were worried about is that if we swing too far to one side and offer up this massive market share right out of the gate to these to mega producers who can immediately flood in and sew up that market, there's going to be no room for small and medium-sized producers to enter and compete. So it's a fine balance, and I understand why people are nervous, but I would reassure anybody that I spoke to that we're providing a pathway for regular New Mexicans with limited or somewhat limited means to enter and create a diverse marketplace, instead of just giving these massive companies the keys to the castle. So that's there's a bit of a nuance there, but I think Ben hit the nail on the head.
And you addressed that, Ben, when you were talking about the micro licensures that are going to be available. Can you kind of explain that to people who might be listening right now and possibly some budding entrepreneurs?
Yeah, certainly. I think there's a lot of discussion in the process about how do we make this industry look more like the craft brewing industry, where you have small breweries across the state that kind of do their own thing. They offer boutique products. And the goal was to have more of that and less, Kmart type cannabis operations in New Mexico. So one of the more successful, one of the more interesting and I really, again, forward-thinking pieces of this legislation where there are two different types of micro business license. So there's a micro cultivation license, which can grow up to 200 plants. It's a $1,000 license fee. Really removing access to entry, really removing barriers to entry so that small and medium businesses can enter into the market. And then there's also a micro integrated license, which does the same thing, 200 plants, also allows for a single retail space or additional retail spaces for another $500 annually. And then kind of light manufacturing procedures. So none of the like ethanol extraction, none of the really dangerous flammable forms of manufacturing, but you can definitely make a bunch of manufactured products. And I think what we're going to see is the state really leaning into those micro licenses, and they can either be entry points into the industry. You can start with a micro license and then build up to a full license. Or, if you have a small family farm and you just want to divert part of your field and shift part of your crop to cannabis, then that could just be, part of your farm's business plan moving forward. And those micro licenses could be what is right for you long term. But a lot of the challenges that we talked about is New Mexico is a poor state. Access to capital is a problem in multiple industries, and that is definitely going to be a challenge in the cannabis industry too. So the discussion was, how do we create these entry points? How do we create these authentic opportunities for New Mexicans to get into the business early on and really create the industry that they want?
So does the cap on plant production help those smaller, medium-sized folks kind of get into the game?
Yeah, and this was another one of the big points of contention that we worked out through the legislative process, and I think the end product is really good. And there were some that were arguing for unlimited production, kind of saying that this was the free market ideal, and we should really let the free market decide how this works. And the concern with our members was, well, if it's unlimited production, then you're just going to have the top 5 existing medical producers quickly get 20,000 plants in the ground and get that market share without creating opportunity for anybody else. So the end thing that we landed on with this legislation is for the first few years, there is going to be production management that's handled by RLD, and it's going to be a process where they look at the median production across legal states and kind of adjust those numbers for a New Mexico population. So when you refer to the plant count, that production management piece is, I think, really important, and that's what's going to make it possible for small and medium-sized businesses to compete, because it's not going to artificially drive the cost to produce cannabis into the ground, which would maybe be good for consumers on a short term, but it's going to really create opportunities for these small and medium producers and businesses to create economies of scale in their business and be successful.
A lot of supporters of this piece of legislation have cited Colorado as a success story and what it can deliver as far as state revenue goes. In 2014, when Colorado rolled out their program, during that first year, they were able to bring in over $67,500,000. That's just from February to the end of the year. By 2017, we're looking at $638 million, over $638 million in state revenue by 2017. And we've seen it go up. It cracked $1 billion in 2019. And just this year, $1.6 billion so far in revenue for the state in Colorado. It took a little bit to get going, of course, but what can New Mexicans expect in our state who may be expecting this big revenue boom from what they saw in Colorado? What should we expect?
I think what we should expect is solid recurring revenue for our state that is part of the plan to kind of move New Mexico away from the boom and bust cycle of the oil and gas industry. I don't want anybody to expect that revenue from adult use cannabis is going to replace the oil and gas industry. It's not going to be the silver bullet that fixes all of our financial woes. But Colorado hit $10 billion in revenue over the life of its recreational cannabis program. And I think it's going to be really important for New Mexico from an economic and revenue standpoint. But I think the more important part, and Representative Martinez and Representative Romero alluded to this a lot, is we're really creating an industry that's going to work for New Mexico. It's going to be by and for New Mexicans. And the simple act of legalizing cannabis for adults is going to start to undo some of the harm that the racist war on drugs has caused in New Mexico and across the country. So I think for lots of legislators, the revenue is kind of nice and eye candy in the background, but I think what we're excited about in this industry is finally moving forward and redressing the fact that this plant has been prohibited for 100 years, and the result of that prohibition has been undue harm on brown and black communities and poor people in New Mexico. And we're going to start to undo those harms, and the revenue is kind of a nice benefit of that, but it's not going to solve all of our financial woes, but it's definitely going to be a small part of the bigger picture in how New Mexico kind of ends our reliance on oil and gas, which is good when it's good, and when it's not good, our state is really left in a bad situation.
Yeah, our audience is certainly pretty familiar with the challenges as we've covered them, but I want to hear from you, Wylie, as somebody on the ground. Why did you go into this industry, and what are some of the challenges you are facing in this industry as we move on here in New Mexico?
Sure. So I entered the industry like many people do, out of a passion for it. I have been a medical patient in New Mexico since 2009, and continued to have a intimate relationship with the plant since then. And it's there's a lot of challenges to expect down the road. I mean, there's sort of the ones that we all know of because of the sort of disconnect between state and federal regulation and the challenges with access to banking and capital. I think that New Mexico specific challenges are going to be more around responsible use of water and access to institutional knowledge. So the vast majority of institutional knowledge in cannabis, and especially in cultivating, lives on the West Coast of the United States. And so there's sort of a gap between the legacy producers and people who have spent 10, 20 plus years growing this plant and learning from trial and error, and the new guard, myself included, who are coming in to try to take the baton and use that knowledge to grow and adapt to scaling challenges, regulatory restraints. The big thing about institutional knowledge that doesn't apply in this new era is there was no oversight. And so, people could spray whatever poisonous pesticide they wanted, as long as they were able to bring their product to market. And there was no, sense of feedback from the consumer, right? They either bought it or they didn't. There wasn't this robust open marketplace and exchange of ideas where if you produce something that was subpar or even worse was harmful to your end user, you were invisible to them as a black market grower. They couldn't reach you or provide feedback, and they didn't have a whole lot of recourse or other options. So the accountability, the knowledge and the experience that it takes to grow, and of course, as always in the desert, just access and responsible use of water.
Now, you brought up something about banks not really wanting to touch this industry, dealing with so much cash in this industry. We've seen a lot of companies and businesses in this field invest in security. How much of a cost is that for you, Wylie, and in the industry that folks should consider?
Sure. I mean, it's huge. It's it's just another form of insurance because the capital exists in a solid, tangible form. You have to invest in security. Not only is it required by the state that you have certain security protocols, but for your own best interest to make sure that your employees are safe, and that your product isn't getting stolen and diverted, and that you're not experiencing these massive capital losses from being robbed or anything of the like. That security is huge. You have to have it. So it's definitely a very significant portion of anybody's balance sheet.
Wylie, your thoughts on the 12% excise tax and how that's going to be implemented? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I do. And I'm happy that, part of the conversation about the tax structure was really centered around keeping it accessible and keeping it competitive with the illicit market. The idea that we're going to generate all this revenue is kind of contingent on being more attractive than the illicit market. And, we can have all of the diversity and access and different varieties of products, but the bottom line, especially in a poor state like New Mexico, is going to be dollars and cents. Like if you can't afford access to all these cool things, you're just going to go with the bare minimum, access that you can get from the illicit market. So I'm pretty happy with the way that the tax structure ended up.
Okay, we just have about a minute and a half left on this segment, but I'd like to get your final thoughts on this issue, Ben. Something perhaps we haven't covered or thought about in this discussion.
Yeah, I think this was just the initial first step. Passing this legislation was the first hurdle that we have to overcome, but the real work starts now, and it starts with the Regulation and Licensing Department in promulgating rules that really fine-tune the framework for how we move forward. It starts with finding sources of capital to help these micro producers and to help other producers quickly scale and be successful before we have out of state, big money from California or big money from Canada come into the market. And I think the opportunity over the next 12 to 18 months to really make this industry work in New Mexico, not only for the immediate future, but for the long term when we expect cannabis to be federally legalized is huge. And I'm just really grateful to our governor and our legislators for passing it. And that was no small task to call a special session and get us across the finish line in 2 days. And now the real work starts, and I'm grateful to Wylie and other thoughtful producers, legacy producers from the medical cannabis industry who are going to offer their insight and wisdom and really make sure that we fine tune this new industry for New Mexico. Okay,
Wylie, in about 30 seconds, can you give us your closing thoughts, please?
Yeah, I'm excited for this next step. It is a huge moment for New Mexico in terms of racial justice and social justice, and it's also a huge moment for building an exciting economy that is going to reflect the diversity of the state that we live in. So I'm just happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to staying at the forefront and moving the ball forward.
Wylie Atherton, General Manager of 7 Point Farms, and Ben Lewinger, Executive Director of New Mexico's Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. Thank you both for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
During the special legislative session in New Mexico, state lawmakers approved 2 separate bills addressing cannabis legalization. House Bill 2, let's start with that, the Cannabis Regulation Act. This bill creates a comprehensive plan for the regulation, licensing, commercial cannabis production, distribution, sale, and consumption of cannabis for people 21 and older. It allows for the purchase of at least 2 ounces of cannabis flowers, 16 grams of extract, and 800 milligrams of edible cannabis. Adults of age can have up to 6 plants, 12 per household. This bill also creates a new cannabis control division that will regulate, administer, and collect fees, as well as the Cannabis Regulatory Advisory Committee to help with rules and best practices. The bill implements a 12% excise tax, with just over 33% of that tax going to local governments. Licensed sales are to begin no later than April 2022. Now to Senate Bill 2, which provides for the expungement of arrest and conviction records for certain cannabis offenses and can lead to a recall or dismissal of sentences for some incarcerated people. Some context on this issue: last year, Pew Research, using FBI crime reporting data, showed that 4 out of 10 arrests in the U.S. in 2018 were for the possession, sale, or manufacture of marijuana. Now, out of that 40%, 92% of the arrests were for possession, and only 8% was for the sale and manufacture of the drug. Let's now talk with 2 New Mexico state lawmakers who have different perspectives on this issue. Please welcome District 35 Republican State Senator Crystal Diamond, who serves on the Senate Finance Committee. We're also joined by Micaela Lara-Cadena, District 33 Democratic State Representative, who serves on the House Judiciary and House Taxation and Revenue Committee. Thank you both for joining us. I'd like to start off with you, Representative Lara-Cadena, since this bill came through your committee, House and Taxation and Revenue Committee. Why did you support this bill legalizing cannabis in New Mexico? Why do you think it's a good bill for our state?
Good morning, and thank you for having us today. Certainly, before I voted on this bill in committee twice, in tax and the judiciary and the House floor, I took a lot of consideration and conversations with constituents from here in southern New Mexico and across the state. Fundamentally, for me, I trust New Mexicans to make their own decisions about their bodies and lives, and of course have an expectation that they will do so in a responsible way that doesn't endanger others or themselves, frankly. As someone that gets to serve on the House Tax Committee, I have made a longstanding commitment to make sure that we have a broad and diverse revenue base to really fund and pull in the kind of resources that our state needs to build healthy and thriving economies, to cover our schools and our roads and what it means to keep New Mexicans thriving. So I feel that, yes, I trust New Mexicans to make their own decisions about what kind of products they consume and how they do so. And I'm grateful that this opens incredible opportunities for us to build new emerging industries and bring in additional tax dollars that New Mexico needs.
Senator Diamond, you voted against these bills dealing with the legalization of cannabis in the special session. Why did you vote no?
Thank you, first of all, for having us, Anthony. And I will begin by saying this. Unlike Representative Cadena, I do sit in the Senate side on Senate Finance, and I did not see this bill come across my committee. And so many of my concerns and concerns of my colleagues weren't so much just the content of what was included and the intent of this bill, but the process in which this was passed. I ultimately voted no because of that process was so concerning. I'll be very honest with you. We met for a 60-day legislative session, and both Dems and Rs could not come to a consensus on what this bill would look like when it comes out to legalize recreational marijuana. Unfortunately, the governor didn't like that answer and called us back in for a special session during Holy Week, just days after we had already adjourned. I will tell you that the Senate side did not see that final House version of the bill. It was less than 24 hours before we returned back to Santa Fe. So many of us are still digesting what we actually passed. I believe it was sloppy legislation. It was shotgun legislation. And unfortunately, what happened is it became very hyper partisan. And I make this note to say legalization of marijuana is not a partisan issue. In fact, in the Senate side, we had Senator Cliff Pirtle, who had a bill very similar and has been very involved in the process of trying to create consensus, just so that as a legislator, we're producing good legislation, good policy, right?
Okay, Senator Diamond, real quick though, I mean, you mentioned you didn't really have so much problem with the issue. I'd like to kind of dive into that a little bit more. Do you support the legalization of cannabis in New Mexico?
Let me be very clear. I still would oppose the bill, and there's many within, that's not a partisan issue. So there was Dems and Rs across the aisle that have different perspectives. I am not in favor of legalization of recreational cannabis. My number one concerns were employer protection. To the credit of this sponsor, I believe those employer protections were addressed in this bill. I do believe that law enforcement concerns, however, were not addressed, and the impacts to the medical industry was also not addressed in that. So what happened is, instead of having a bill that passed with bipartisan support, there was no Republican support of the final legislation that came out.
Okay, Representative Lara-Cadena, I'd like to hear your thoughts more on this. Do you feel this was shotgun legislation, as Senator Diamond said?
Thank you for the question, and I appreciate hearing some of those remarks. For better or worse, the legalization of recreational cannabis has been something that's been debated vigorously and considered over many, many years now. Actually, my predecessor, Representative Bill McCamley, was one of the first to introduce a proposal as early as 2015. One of the things I think that's profound and important in New Mexico's legislative process is that we invest in what committees know and what each of us brings from our nuanced perspectives and positions, and we work to make bills better. As this bill got chewed up and spit out all over the place over the last several years, every time it was introduced, it appreciated and addressed, I believe, more of those concerns, important concerns coming from New Mexico's employers and business communities, coming from public health advocates and those that built and rely on New Mexico's medical marijuana system. And by the time we got to the special session, we were in and out pretty quickly, but there had been so much work to negotiate, as the senator named, on both sides of the aisle to make sure that that bill we brought in a special session was ready to go, and importantly, had taken into consideration so many of the learnings over many, many years.
Oh, Representative Lara-Cadena, I mean, was a special session really necessary, though? I mean, it was, Senator Diamond said that everything felt very rushed, and so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that issue.
When someone's elected governor on either side of the aisle, that authority to call us into special session is within their purview. So I'm proud of the work we got done in the 60-day, and I know that I'm grateful I had room to show up and meet the responsibilities of my job when we got called into the special.
Okay, Representative Lara-Cadena, I'd like to stay with you since you sit on the committee dealing with tax and revenue. Your thoughts on the excise tax? Obviously, it was amended during the special session. It has a 12% excise tax, and it's to increase annually by 1% starting in 2025 and continuing for 6 years. Do you think that this is enough? Some may have some concerns about it not going enough, and then there's also been some who have said that this might be taxed too much. Your thoughts on the excise tax?
Certainly. As you noted, we amended that accelerator on the excess tax in the House Tax Committee during the special session. So just to make sure your viewers understand, and because I continue to practice saying this out loud, what's going to happen is for the first 3 years, there will be a 12% excise tax that's leveled on these recreational cannabis products. That is the base that will then have on top of it both the state and local GRT. So there will be this window of where it lands. After those 3 years and for a 6-year period, that excise tax will eventually go up in what we call an accelerator and land at 18%. So when you get to that 18 plus GRT, we're looking at somewhere about 26%. That's very competitive for our neighboring states, even to consider as far away as California, where they're taxing at a much higher rate. We took and listened a lot to folks that want to make sure, as you've noted, if we're overtaxing, people stay in the illicit market, and we certainly don't want to allow that to happen. If we're undertaxing, we're not bringing in these crucial and needed resources that New Mexico deserves, and certainly what we're looking to as we increase and expand our economic base.
Senator Diamond, now that this has been passed by the state legislature, what are your thoughts on how it can affect your district?
I think that this could have a very unfair impact really on rural and remote areas compared to urban areas. And I make this point because a lot of our employers are still very concerned. I do appreciate that the specific legislation that came out, I believe, addressed many of those employer concerns. We have some concerns for law enforcement. As you know, my entire Senate district stretches across the southern New Mexico border. Our law enforcement are already overworked. Their finances and their resources are stretched to the max. And so there's some great concern among our law enforcement officers still. This is just equally concerning for me. I also am just concerned that we may have just passed legislation that could have, for those who were supportive of this issue, could have been some of the best legislation in the state. And what happened is when we rushed through this, in my opinion, there was no need to call a special session. This does not constitute an emergency. We are on the heels of a pandemic in which educational loss and small business recovery should still have remained our priority and not the legalization of marijuana. That we have rushed through this. We are going to have to meet for a special session this fall, regardless for redistricting. And I just want to make a point that it's a shame that both parties were not able to meet over the interim and to come to a conclusion, move forward what they consider to be the best legislation addressing this issue.
Okay, well, you said that they missed out on an opportunity to make this bill the best bill that New Mexico's ever seen. What do you mean by that?
I don't mean the best bill New Mexico's ever seen, but really nationwide, leading the area and how you would properly address the legalization of cannabis. And so I say this because this is the most hyper-partisan bill we saw come out of the session.
So what's the best way, what's the best way to address this issue, to lead the nation? I mean, what are your thoughts? What needed to be included in this bill to do that?
The best way to address this legislation is no different than any other legislation, and that is to include bipartisan support among the entire legislature, so that it's a collective that comes out.
Okay.
I want to weigh in on that question and talk about what really sets this piece of legislation as a model for the country to look to. One of the reasons, like I've said, I trust New Mexicans to make their decisions about their bodies and lives. My priority was always decriminalization of marijuana. I see and have understood that there was a racist drug war in this country that targeted specifically Black communities, communities of color, and others with incarceration and criminal justice penalties for using marijuana. One of the things that was really important to me in this bill is that we had a social justice component so that communities most impacted by the war on drugs had room to build their own economic investment in this new industry. So specifically, we've made through our 10-point licensure system for those that want to be part of this new industry, different opportunities through micro business licenses. So people with less capital, people in my district, people across rural New Mexico can get a micro business producer license, which means they can grow up to 200 plants for up to $1,000. For less than $1,000, if there's folks out there that have water rights like I do, that have land like so many families do, and want to potentially try out being part of this industry, unlike any other state, we created carve-outs so that they had a real shot to get in there and invest in their own family and their own financial future. When we talk about the vertical integrated licenses, that is folks that will do everything from grow the cannabis on their ag land to sell it in a retail store and all those points in between. We even created a micro business license for $2,500, again, less than 200 plants. So some of our historical communities, our rural communities, if they'd like to make a shot at this, that they have a competitive edge and room to be part of this market in a way like no other state in the country has seen.
Representative Lara-Cadena, a lot of criticism on this bill was that it was written for insiders and big companies in the cannabis industry, and that they were going to have a head start on this issue and be able to expand their businesses and make it less competitive. You brought up a couple of things, but was that enough to really help entrepreneurs and people who may not come from the big industries? Because banks won't touch this issue when you come to having access to capital.
Anthony, we live in a capitalistic world, and it is real that folks and investors that have big dollars are always going to have an advantage. What we've done here is do our best, and we fought hard for this. I and many others that come from a background of community organizing and working to show up for our families. We fought over years to make sure that we did have these carve-outs so that our New Mexican families that have less resources, but potentially are land rich, like we always say in New Mexico, people maybe don't have those cash dollars, but they have land, they have water rights, have room to show up and make their mark in this economy. As one example, in a conservative estimate, we're looking at potentially $250 million in economic activity a year, with about $50 million coming back into our state general funds. A lot of that is expected to happen in our borderlands, including districts like those I represent here, where we have folks coming over from Texas for their weekends or deciding how to spend their time, and again, making responsible decisions about what they consume. One of the things that I imagined and thought about is if even here in Micaela, where I was born and raised, somebody wanted to get in on this with a micro business license, that might mean that they're growing 100 plants in Micaela, and they're putting that product into some kind of edible, like a Micaela brownie. And if they have that heart and spirit and drive to brand that and talk about that niche of Micaela grown edible brownies and grow that into a thing, they can bring in those dollars and potentially make it out into those bigger licenses.
All right. Okay. I want to give Senator Diamond a chance to weigh in on this issue, because you brought up, of course, Senate Bill 2 dealing with expungement. Senator Diamond, your thoughts on this bill? You voted against it. Why?
I did vote against expungement too. I don't think that we can retroactively say that because we're changing the laws now, we're going to give passes to people who broke the law in years past. So I did vote against that as well. I'm also not as optimistic about the revenues that this will bring into the state. And I think many people who sit on finance over on the Senate side also have cautioned people that they are overly optimistic on the revenues that this is going to bring in. We say this because here we are talking about the revenues that legalization of marijuana can bring into the state of New Mexico. And at the same time, there was a great attack on oil and gas. And as we know, it constitutes almost 40% of our budget. While I support any diversification of revenues into the state, I certainly don't think that this is going to be the win-all way for New Mexico to supplement those revenues that are going to be lost through oil and gas by putting them out at the same time. So I just think it was very contradicting legislation in a way to diversify revenues for the state as well.
Okay, we just have about a couple minutes left on this segment, but I want to give you both an opportunity to kind of have some closing thoughts on this issue. Representative Lara-Cadena, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you. And again, this is democracy for you, and I appreciate that you all create a venue for us to talk about how it plays out and the work we have to do to continue improving on this process. I'm incredibly grateful to have heard from so many New Mexicans on this issue and a broad spectrum of issues over the 60-day session and the special. What we've done here over many, many years is work to create a responsible platform and policy for adults, folks over 21, to decide when, if, and how they responsibly consume cannabis products. What we're doing is pulling people and our young people away from an illicit market and making sure that we are doing so in a way that looks at New Mexico's financial future and diversifies our economy in a timely and appropriate manner.
Okay, Senator Diamond, your closing thoughts.
Thank you. You know, this legislation is of great magnitude and will have great impacts on the state of New Mexico. The fact that we left out an entire party in the process to come to a conclusion on to make sure we're meeting everyone's needs, and the fact that we rushed it through a special session after we couldn't get it done in a regular session remains concerning. And most concerning is that we passed legislation of this magnitude that will have impact on New Mexicans throughout the entire state during a session that was completely closed to the public. There were no lobbyist involvement. There was no public involvement. We literally passed legislation behind locked doors. And I think it was a disservice to a number of New Mexicans out there.
Okay, I want to thank you both for joining us. State Senator Crystal Diamond and State Representative Micaela Lara-Cadena, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
In closing, polling has shifted in the last decade towards favoring marijuana legalization. A 2019 survey from the Pew Research Center's American Trends panel showed that over 59% of Americans support the legalization of recreational and medical marijuana. 32% support medical use only, and just 8% say it should not be legal. Pew Research also reported that the share of U.S. adults who oppose legalization fell from 52% in 2010 to 32% in 2019. Thank you so much for joining us for Issues and Answers Cannabis Legalization. I'm Anthony Moreno.